Tony, thank you very much for your kind words. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your warm welcome. To David Kemp, my friend and former parliamentary colleague, to Tony Nutt, a great fighter for liberalism for many, many years, I say thank you for all you have done. I am so pleased to be here, and I am so buoyed by the support that I have received from the great Liberal Party here in Victoria, the home and the heartland of liberalism in this country. Now, ladies and gentlemen, last December I said that I could not promise victory, but I could promise a contest. And since then, we have been giving Mr Rudd the fight of his life. Since then, we have been an alternative, not an echo, and since then, we have offered the Australian people a clear choice, not a series of weak compromises with a bad government. And make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, the Rudd government is a bad government. It is a seriously bad government. I ask you to cast your minds back to the pivotal moment in the last election. It was the moment when the now Prime Minister said, and I quote, "The reckless spending has to stop." This was Mr Rudd. This was Mr Rudd, the greatest spender in Australia's history, as he has turned out, saying the reckless spending must stop. But this is just one of many broken promises. There have been a whole host of broken promises since this government came to power. There was Fuel Watch that lasted just a couple of months. There was Grocery Watch that never even got started. There were the 35 GP super clinics, of which I think 3 have been completed. There was the baby bonus, which he would never means test but has, and there was the private health insurance rebate that he would never means test but wants to. But most of all, there was this promise that the reckless spending must stop, and this boast that he, and not John Howard, was the real economic and fiscal conservative. Well, what a fraud Prime Minister Rudd has turned out to be on that point. He has turned a $20 billion surplus into a $50 billion deficit. He has turned $60 billion plus of accumulated funds into $150 billion worth of net debt. He has distributed $900 cheques to the Australian people like confetti, but at the same time he has run up $7,000 worth of net debt for every Australian man, woman and child. He is a fiscal phony. That's what the Prime Minister is. Now, ladies and gentlemen, he boasts that he has saved Australia from a recession. Well, wrong, dead wrong, Mr Rudd. It was the reforms of John Howard and Peter Costello that saved Australia from a recession. And let's give credit where it was due. The reforms of John Howard and Peter Costello were vital reforms, vital for the future of this country, but they built on the equally tough reforms of Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, Labor leaders of more courage and more integrity and more honesty than the current Prime Minister. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the reforms of the past governments, not the spending spree of the current government, which is responsible for saving Australia from a recession. And if Australia has avoided this recession because of the reforms of past governments, we are likely to enter a new recession at some time in the future because of the lack of reform and the and the rollbacks that we have seen from the Rudd government over the last 18 months. In fact, what we have seen from the Rudd government is the Prime Minister using the threat of a recession to revert to the Labor pattern of borrow and spend, the Labor pattern of borrow and spend, which did so much to compromise the financial position of this country in the generations leading up to the Howard government in 1996. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a Prime Minister who cannot manage the economy. This is a Prime Minister who is now vulnerable because the Australian people are waking up to the fact that this is a government which cannot be trusted with public money. He cannot be trusted with public money. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have recently been, as some of you might know, on a listening tour through much of regional Australia. If I am looking a little bit fitter and trimmer than usual, it's because it has been quite a strenuous listening tour that I have been on. But it has given me the opportunity to speak to people at a level of candour, a level of engagement which Mr Rudd does not get. And what I can tell you is that out there in regional Australia in particular, there is white-hot anger against this government's waste of public money. People are incandescent with rage at what they see as this government's crimes against the taxpayer. Let me tell you about Berrydale Public School in southern New South Wales. 3 years ago, they built a substantial double brick building, a large double brick building that was purpose-built for that school, and it cost them $330,000. A couple of months ago, they got a glorified tin shed that they cannot use because it is a fire hazard, and it cost them $900,000. That is typical of the waste and mismanagement of the Rudd government. Then in Marulan, about 160 kilometres south of Sydney, a small country public school. They wanted a hall. What did they get? They got a library, even though they already had a library. You will get a library whether you need one or not. And it cost 3 times what local builders thought would be a fair price. And then a week or so earlier, I had been at Mount St Thomas Public School near Wollongong. 3 years ago, under the Howard government's Investing in Our Schools program, the Mount St Thomas Public School had built a covered outdoor learning area the size of a basketball court. They got that for $125,000, and they were able to get this large structure because the Howard government did not give the money to the state educational bureaucracies. It gave the money to the school community, and it said to the school community, we trust you to know what's best for your school, and we trust you to know how to get the best value for the money that we have entrusted to your care. So for $125,000, the Mount St Thomas School got a covered outdoor learning area bigger than a basketball court. And when they found out that they were getting $2.5 million from the Rudd government, they thought, fantastic, we can rebuild the whole school. Well, wrong, I'm sorry. They have not been able to rebuild the whole school. The school is in the condition that it has always been in, but they do have a brand new hall, which they think is a glorified tin shed. It's not big enough to hold the entire school population. The school community has now got to go out and fundraise to heat it, to cool it, to equip it. And just down the road there was a Catholic school which didn't go through the Rudd government's bureaucratic system, and they got a bigger hall for less than half the price. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these rip-offs are taking place right around the country. We don't know about all of them because some school communities are understandably intimidated by threats from Education Department officials that if they don't toe the line, they won't get the money. But these rip-offs are the tip of an iceberg of waste which is typical of the way this Rudd government does not respect your money, the money which it holds on trust from the taxpayers. In fact, of the $16 billion worth of so-called building the education revolution spending, the Australian people will be lucky to get $8 billion worth of value. Well, it's not good enough, and a government which can't be trusted with the public's money does not deserve to be re-elected. So, ladies and gentlemen, the government is vulnerable because it can't be trusted with the public's money. The government's also vulnerable because it can't be trusted with people's safety. It can't be trusted with people's safety. Now, we all know now about the 5,000 people and the 110 boats that have arrived at Christmas Island since Mr Rudd boasted that he was more compassionate than his predecessor. But what about the boats and the people that didn't make it? The boats and the people that were tempted onto the ocean seas by Mr Rudd's change of a policy that was working. And I say to Mr Rudd that there is nothing compassionate about a policy which encourages people to risk their lives on the open sea because they believe that if they can just get to Australia, they can claim permanent residency here. This is a seriously bad policy, and it is a seriously unnecessary outcome of a Prime Minister who was incapable of leaving well enough alone. John Howard found a problem, created a solution. Kevin Rudd found a solution and created not just a problem, but a tragedy. That's what we've got from this Prime Minister. And then, of course, there's the Prime Minister's Pink Bats program. This was going to be the program that helped to save us from climate change by stopping all that unnecessary use of electricity. What have we got? We've got 4 deaths linked to this program. We've had more than 120 house fires linked to this program. We've had 240,000 Australian homes that have dodgy or dangerous insulation in their roofs, all because Mr Rudd was too proud, he and his officials were too proud to heed the warnings that were given to him time and time and time again before this program started and before these tragedies happened. And now, the Prime Minister, who couldn't put pink bats into people's roofs safely, the Prime Minister who could not build school halls without rip-off after rip-off, he now wants to run your public hospital system. Well, as my old friend and mentor, the late, great B.A. Santa Maria would have said, this, ladies and gentlemen, is a moonbeam from the larger lunacy. You know, not for nothing was Prime Minister Rudd known as Dr. Death when he was the Director General of the Queensland Cabinet Office. The man who now says he supports local hospital boards and the man who now says He wants to get more beds into public hospitals. When he was running, as he claims, the great state of Queensland, he cut 2,000 beds from the public hospital system and he abolished all the local boards. Now, for 2 years, Mr Rudd, as Prime Minister, has been telling us that the big issue wasn't hospitals at all. No, it wasn't hospitals. He hardly mentioned hospitals over the first 2 years of his Prime Ministership. The big issue then wasn't hospitals, it was in fact climate change. Remember, climate change was the greatest social, political and moral challenge of our time. That's what Mr Rudd said. But having failed to save the planet from climate change, he now wants to save the public hospital system from state governments. Well, you know, he might get some kind of symbolic agreement next Monday. He might get some kind of symbolic agreement next Monday. But ladies and gentlemen, take my tip. The coming COAG will be Copenhagen revisited. It will be Copenhagen revisited. It will be testimony to this Prime Minister's inability to see things in perspective, his inability to deliver an outcome, and most of all, his inability to work with people. He cannot work with other people unless they are prepared to be his doormats. He can't work with his own staff, who have been leaving him in droves. He can't work with many of his own colleagues whose opinion of the Prime Minister is unprintable, and he can't even work with the state Labor premiers who are now forming a posse against him, led, I have to say, by your own Premier, John Brumby. Now, I want to say this. I don't think that Victorian public hospitals are perfect. Far from it. Far from it. But why would Mr Brumby willingly part with 30% of his GST money so that the federal government can do badly what the Victorian government has been doing reasonably well for the last 2 decades since the great reforms of the last great Premier of Victoria, Jeff Kennett? Why should he do that? And I ask this question: how can a Prime Minister who promised to end the blame game, why can't this Prime Minister work with the Premiers rather than threaten them with a completely unnecessary referendum? This is a man who is incapable of working even with people who basically share his own views. And a Prime Minister who is incapable of working with other Australians of goodwill is a Prime Minister who does not deserve to be re-elected later on this year. So, ladies and gentlemen, there is a clear choice. There is a clear choice. It will be between talk and action. It will be between spin and substance. It will be between what is counterfeit and what is authentic. That is the choice that we will have, that you will have at the election coming up at the end of this year. Now, my job, our job as an opposition, has been to hold the government to account. But it's not just to hold the government to account. It's also to demonstrate to the Australian people how a coalition government will do better, how our country would be different and better under a coalition government. And I think it's already becoming quite clear how Australia would be different and better under a coalition government. We would be a more secure Australia under a coalition government. We would stop the boats coming to our country. John Howard stopped the boats. We did it before, and we can do it again. And we will essentially stop the boats by denying to the people smugglers the product that they now have, thanks to Mr Rudd, to sell to desperate people in the countries in our region. We will have a more prosperous Australia under a coalition government. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, let me assure you that work choices is dead. But I also want to remind you that for 4 elections running, the coalition won a mandate to take the unfair dismissal monkey off the back of small business, to allow workers and managers to conclude fair agreements with each other, because we knew that what our country needs is freedom as well as fairness in the workplace, and we will again seek that kind of a mandate. But we won't waste $45 billion rebuilding a government telecommunications behemoth just a few years after getting rid of the last one back into the hands of the people. We will not make that mistake. And we will not saddle Australians with a great big new tax on everything in the name of a misguided environmentalism. I am as ready as the next man to protect our environment because we only have one planet. But, ladies and gentlemen, you do not protect the environment and you do not reduce emissions by putting a new tax on the necessities of daily life. That is no way to go, and we won't do it. But, ladies and gentlemen, as well as a more secure Australia, as well as a more prosperous Australia, we will also have, under the next coalition government, a more progressive Australia. Now, I know many of you would have been a little surprised when we committed ourselves to a decent, fair income, paid parental leave scheme. But I am proud to be the leader of a Liberal Conservative party that has finally embraced this visionary and necessary change for the people of Australia. It's good for families. It's good for families because it will maintain their incomes when they need it most. It's good for women because women will finally have real choice. They will have real money for real time to bond with their babies. And it's also good for the economy because, as the intergenerational report of Peter Costello reminded us, if we are to sustain ourselves in the decades ahead, we need more people, we need higher productivity, and we need greater participation, and a paid parental leave scheme will deliver all that in spades. So, ladies and gentlemen, I am very proud and very honoured to be the leader of this great party. I am conscious of the giant shoes that I am striving to fill. This party has been extremely well led. 3 of this party's leaders have been giants of Australian history, and I am conscious of the honour you do me in choosing me and in sustaining me as the leader of this party. We have an extraordinary challenge ahead of us, but I think we can do it. I used to think, ladies and gentlemen, that the longer the Rudd government lasted, the better the Howard government would look. And it's true that compared with the present situation, the Howard era looks like a lost golden age of prosperity. But I now think that the longer the Rudd government lasts, the better the Whitlam government looks. Mr Rudd campaigned during the last election as a younger and groovier version of John Howard. But since then, he has governed as a more prolix and more self-important version of Gough Whitlam. It's not good enough, and people know it's not good enough, and that's why we have a real prospect of victory. Now, it is, as I said, an enormous challenge. Not since 1931 has a first-term federal government been defeated, but, ladies and gentlemen, 79-year-old records are just waiting to fall. And we shouldn't forget how sick the Australian public are becoming of the Labor style. We've seen it in all the states. We've seen the spin. We've seen the fibs. We've seen the endless re-announcements. We've seen the fact that nothing actually seems to get better under the state Labor governments. And what we now have in Tasmania and South Australia are state Labor governments still in power, even though they were effectively beaten in elections. And people will feel very ripped off when they vote against state Labor but don't get rid of state Labor governments. So it is there for us to capitalise on. We can win this election, provided we are our best selves, provided we are united, provided we are true to our principles, provided we avoid the ego trips and the faction fights to which even the Liberal Party can sometimes be prone. It's all there for us if we are our best selves. And ladies and gentlemen, that applies to me as much as it applies to everyone else in this room. The next few months are our supreme test. They're the supreme test of our party, they're the supreme test of our parliamentary team, and they're the supreme test of our federal parliamentary leadership. But I am confident that we can rise to this great challenge for the long-term benefit of the people of Australia. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks, Helen. Thank you. When I said I was confident that we could rise to this challenge, I didn't mean for you to rise to your feet. But nevertheless, it's exceedingly gratifying. We can win. We really can win.